Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to give it 2 to 3 more minutes to let a few more attendees trickle in, but we'll be getting started shortly. Thank you. For anyone that just joined, we're giving it another minute or two to allow for the remaining attendees to trickle in, and we'll be getting started shortly. Thank you. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on GxP compliance in the digital lab and how Cynote can support your journey to GxP compliance. In this webinar, we're going to be exploring how compliance expectations may evolve in a digital environment, what regulators or auditors might expect to see from your electronic records, and how Cynote can successfully support your journey to compliance along with a few examples of specific use cases in terms of how you might be using SciNote in your compliance journey. Today, I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Mathias. Mathias is the VP of Product at SciNote and also one of the co-founders of SciNote.
Hi, everyone.
All right, so next we have a quick look at the agenda for today's webinar. So Mathias is just going to give you an overview about GxP across the EU, the US, and we'll also be talking through some real-life use cases of GxP and how SciNote can play a relevant role there. And then we'll be quickly looking at going digital, what it looks like between paper and software, and then some more specifics about how SciNote can support your work in GxP environments, followed by a Q&A session. A quick note about the Q&A session. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to use the Q&A option or the chat option in your Zoom toolbar. We'll be answering questions along the way, and also towards the end, we'll be looking at the questions posted in there and addressing them one by one. And just a quick overview about SciNote for those of you that are new to SciNote or haven't heard about SciNote. We have been in the industry for about 10 years now. We have a global presence with customers all across the world. We're used by a lot of major Fortune 500 companies, along with 2 large federal agencies here in the US. And with that being said, Mathias, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick us off with the first topic on GxP.
Okay. Thank you, Arun, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, also in my name. Since we have a diverse list of attendees, we can have a quick overview of what GxP looks like, what it means. I will not take too much of today's session about this, but let's go through the intro. So the GxP stands for good practice, and the X is usually represents a regulated area within a life science industry. Most familiar examples that everyone is familiar with are GMP, so good manufacturing practice, that covers the manufacturing, testing, quality assurance of various products for human consumption. That includes pharmaceuticals, so medicines, drugs, but as well as food and beverage, cosmetics, and so on. GLP stands for good laboratory practice. That's a set of regulations that usually cover the non-clinical health and environmental studies, toxicology studies, how they are planned, executed, documented, reported, and so on. And the GCP, good clinical practice, covers the regulation for clinical studies that involve human subjects. Although these are different regulations, they do have the same purpose, and that's essentially to ensure the product quality for humans and patients, so patient and consumer safety, through ensuring reproducible and reliable data, so that the organizations can trust the data and the underlying records. The main regulator bodies are European Medicines Agency in Europe, in the US, that's Food and Drug Administration, and then there's Health Canada and TGA in Australia. So there are a few main pillars of compliance. So the data integrity is the underlying one. So of course, records need to ensure we need to ensure that the records are accurate, complete, that they are attributable, so linked to the person who created or modified them, are contemporaneous, and so on. Traceability and related auditability. Organizations need to demonstrate what happened, who created records, who modified them, and how the records change in time. Process control, another important pillar. So the compliance really relies on standardized procedures, clear procedures in place that includes SOPs, and then the related training of personnel, of people, user training, and access control to those SOPs. Validation and qualification, important pillar. Essentially, organizations need to demonstrate that the computerized systems that they use work as intended throughout their life cycle. And the last, as long as we will have people working in GxP environments, that's an important factor. Key things here are assessing training needs, periodic checkups of competency, planning of trainings, and managing the training records. Then, as soon as we are talking about the electronic records. So, next slide, please. We hit into two commonly referred regulations. So one is the EU Annex 11, or Annex 11 in short, and the other one is FDA's 21 CFR Part 11. Which are both part of a broader GMP regulations in the EU side, that is EudraLex Volume 4 GMP guidelines, and on the FDA, that's other parts of Title 21, like 210, 211. Those two, although originated from different geographies, those two let's say lists of requirements are quite similar. They do have some differences, mainly at the level of, in the EU, they're talking a little bit more about computerized system in general. On the FDA side, they're talking specifically about electronic records and signatures. The rest are very similar. And lastly, the main point of both is actually that the systems that the organizations are using are secure, reliable, and properly controlled. So with this, I think I'd like to conclude this very brief intro, and we'd like to get a poll out. So before we dig into the examples of using electronic platforms in the lab, in real life examples, we'd like to ask you, what's your biggest challenge in implementing or maintaining a GxP compliant environment? So please go ahead and let's see how the results weigh in. We'd like to also use this feedback to maybe direct the remaining part of the webinar in the proper direction, and to see how the use cases that we'll be covering today are relevant. Okay, let's wait a little bit more. Yeah, results are getting in. Nice. Okay. Maybe we're good to go to show the results. There have been a couple of, yeah, I think we can share the results. So, well, we see that, yeah, the answers seem to be quite spread around. So, which means that we really have a very diverse audience today, and that the challenges are quite spread around. So I think we'll be touching most of the subjects. So I think nothing is really pointing out, maybe the data management and data integrity. So yeah, with this in mind, I think I'll hand it over to Arun.
Yeah, thank you, Mateusz. So we'll dive into some of the real life use cases that you can use a digital solution like Signote for when it comes to implementing and maintaining GxP related compliance. And you might find, so some of you that responded with data management and data integrity or audit readiness and inspections, you might find some of these use cases that I talk about to be quite relevant to you. So for the use cases, I've broken them down into 3 or 4 broader categories. And so we'll start with looking at where you might be using a very structured protocol execution and results generation, and then also talk about use cases very specific to instrument and equipment management, and then also related to your consumables, sample, material management, and then what happens if you at the company have GxP work and also non-GxP work. What do you do in a scenario like that? So we'll first start with the structured protocol execution. So there's quite a few use cases here that I'll talk through, but I wanted to draw your attention also to the right-hand side of the slide. You'll see some essential system features, and you'll see this appearing on a few of the slides that I talk through. So these are calling out very specific sign-out features that are relevant to this exact use case. And if you have questions on how some of these features work, what they look like, please put them in the chat or bring them up towards the end during the Q&A session. So with that being said, I'll jump right into the first specific use case related to process development and technology transfer. And this one might be particularly relevant for anyone in the audience that's from a CDMO or CRO, because when you're running work on behalf of a sponsor or a partner, you're not just accountable to your own quality system, you're also accountable to theirs. So your partner's auditors might come in and review your records as if they were their own. And when you have a good, strong solution like Signote, you have a platform where those records are structured, they're locked, they're traceable from the moment the work is done, and it's not being cleaned up right before an audit. So everything is happening as the data is being generated and captured in Signote. And then if we look at analytical method validation, so this is a requirement in most pharma and biotech labs, and there is a international pharmaceutical standard for analytical method validation. And this standard requires that you define your experiments up front and you execute exactly against what you designed and defined. So the risk you run with using paper or scattered spreadsheets or Word documents is that if someone adjusts the protocol mid-run or the results get recorded very loosely, this can be a major risk when it comes to an inspection or an audit. In Signote, the protocol is locked before execution even starts, and the results section can also be locked such that there's very defined areas where the scientist or the technician can input data in. The record you end up with is exactly what you can present to an auditor or inspector, and it would contain your protocol, results, signatures, timestamps, all in one place. And I'd like to draw your attention to the 2 screenshots on the slides. So this shows you an example of how in a specific protocol, everything can be locked except for very specific elements. So on the second screenshot there, you'll see that there's a table that's unlocked because you would want the scientist or technician to input the raw data into that table. And then a form that's unlocked as well, where they might document some quantitative data or qualitative findings as well. So you have this level of granular control over your protocols and results in Signote. And then moving on to the next use case. So if you are performing stability studies, which can be a long game because you might be running time points over 2 or 3 years, every single pull at each time point has to be executed the same way, regardless of which analyst is doing this or which time point you're doing it at, because you want to be producing results that you can compare side by side across the life of this study. And every vial, every reagent lot that's used at every time point needs to be traceable. And Signote keeps all of it together, the protocol, inventory records, results, everything in a single platform. Nothing lives in a separate system that has to be reconciled later with data that you pull from another system. And then we have cleaning validation. So this one is sometimes overlooked or underestimated when it comes to the documentation burden that this requires. So when it comes to an inspection or an audit, they don't want to just know that you clean the environment. They also want to know what you used, what were the acceptance limits, what you measured, and that you hit those limits every time. And this is not just required during validation runs, but it is required consistently. And a locked sign-out protocol with predefined result fields makes this much more straightforward to demonstrate. The next use case is verification and validation. A quick note here. So verification and validation as a term comes from the medical device world. So it's specific to 21 CFR Part 820. So not technically part of the GxP framework, but the way you execute a V&V study, a defined protocol, controlled data capture, signed off record, it requires the same discipline and has the same intent as GxP requirements. So it's a different regulation, but very similar burden of proof. And for those of you in the audience from the device world, you will definitely resonate with this one. And then the last two under this category, so equipment qualification is quite important because when you receive a new piece of equipment, you have to run it through IQ, OQ, PQ, and you need to be able to produce very clean IQ, OQ, PQ records for critical instruments. And you need to be able to show that all of this was done before any data was generated. And then the last one in this section, computer system validation. Mathiaj is going to talk about this as well a little bit later on, but a quick touch on this. So any computerized system that's used in a GxP environment has to be validated under the GAMP5 requirement. And if you are using Cynote as a software, it also needs to be validated. And Cynote does provide IQ/OQ documentation as a part of a service that we offer. And then jumping on to the next category, relevant to instrument and equipment management. So these are two operational requirements in GxP environment that every lab deals with, regardless of what you're developing. Calibration and PM records are oftentimes looked at during audit or inspections, not because they're complicated, but because it's easy to miss something, especially if you're documenting this on paper or on scattered spreadsheets across different folders on different platforms. And for both of these, I do want to draw your attention to the two screenshots we have on the screen. So the first one shows you how you can use this sign-out structure to document a standardized approach for every calibration time point or every preventative maintenance time point. And with sign-out, since we also have protocol templates, you can template your PM SOP, calibration SOP, and keep leveraging that template at every instance that you need to execute one of these activities. And then, of course, with the electronic signatures, the permission controls, you can have these records reviewed and signed off on directly in Cynote. And at any point, if you're required to provide proof on whether a piece of equipment was calibrated correctly or maintained correctly, you can just use Cynote's report generator and pull a PDF record or a Word document record with all the data contained in all of these little blocks that you see on my screen. And then to sort of complement this, we also have an equipment scheduling module in Cynote where you can pre-schedule when calibrations are due. You can trigger reminders for these calibrations. You can also pre-schedule when PMs are due and trigger reminders for these PMs as well. And then moving on to the next category. So this one is really about the material side of GxP, and it's an area where I see a lot of labs struggling, mostly because the traceability burden often falls on, let's say, paper logs or spreadsheets that weren't really built for this purpose. If we look at the first use case of sample management, this one might hit home a little bit more for anyone in the CRO space or operating in bioanalytical environments. When you're running samples on behalf of a client, sponsor, partner supporting their clinical program, every sample has to be accounted for. So you need to know where it came from, how it's stored, who touched it, what was done with it, and what happened to it after testing. If you lose any one of those data points across this workflow, the data that you generated using that sample now comes into question. And this is where Cynote's inventory module gives you a record of every sample with the full history of what happened to it, and all of that documented directly in Cynote. With reagent traceability, so this one is a GMP and GLP requirement that most labs acknowledge in principle, but sometimes struggle to enforce in practice. So the scenario I always like to point out with prospects or existing customers is this. So imagine a lot of reagent is flagged after has been used to generate some data, either because it failed a retest or because maybe the supplier issued a recall. Now you need to quickly know which studies used this lot and what data was impacted. Now, if that requires someone to go digging through your paper logs or cross-referencing spreadsheets, you're going to have a bit of an issue when it comes to time and accuracy. So in Cynote, every reagent is tracked at the lot level, and it ties consumption to the specific protocol that was used in and what results were generated when it was used in that protocol. And if a lot does get flagged, because of the traceability feature we have in Cynote, you can very easily identify which protocols come into question, which data sets come into question. And then if we look at reference standards, so reference standards deserve specific attention because they're oftentimes used in product release decisions. So an expired or uncertified reference standard in a release test can invalidate that result entirely and result in potentially delaying or even halting a product release. It's a straightforward mistake that happens more often than it should when tracking is done manually. And this is where if you use Cynote to manage reference standards with the certification status, expiration date, usage history, all documented in one place, it minimizes the chances of this happening. And then for this section, lastly, we have cell line management. So this one is probably directly relevant to anyone in biotech, biopharma, working on biologics or cell therapies. In those environments, your cell line is oftentimes the starting material for the product itself. And its characterization and traceability are critical requirements under the GxP framework. And so now moving on to the next category. So we have your inventory, sample, and materials management. So when it comes to incoming material inspection, this is one of those controls that seems like an admin activity until something goes wrong. So the principle is simple. No material goes into a regulated process until it's been inspected and the specifications are validated and it has been released for use. Using an unreleased material, even if it turns out that one spec isn't met, is a violation and renders any data that you generate irrelevant when that material was used. And then we also look at lab scale or low throughput batch documentation. So this one, for any smaller biotech or diagnostics manufacturers, there's sometimes an assumption that because you're making small volumes or a limited number of kits, the documentation requirements are somehow lighter, and they are not. The GxP documentation standard is the same regardless of the scale of manufacturing. What changes is the operational complexity of achieving it, and that's where Cynote can help you. So the protocol in Cynote can basically function as your batch record. Since it's locked, when you execute it and sign off on it, everything in there can be used directly for your batch record. Every material that's used is pulled from the inventory and associated with that record, and the record is complete from the moment that batch has been completed and signed off on. And then the last specific use case in this category is your COA. So the COA is your output that your customer or inspector sees. It certifies that the product or material meets certain specifications. And for that to be credible, it has to be traceable back to the underlying test data that you generated. So who performed the test, what instrument was used, what reference standards were involved, and what the actual results were. And with Cynote, you can generate this data set directly from Cynote. So you effectively have a ready-to-go COA. There is no retyping, there is no transcription required. Everywhere, everything is captured in a single platform here in Cynote. And then the last category of use case I have is, what do you do if you have both R&D or non-GxP environments and GxP environments operating in parallel? And I wanted to wrap up on this slide because it addresses something that comes up quite often in conversations with prospects and customers. And the typical answer here is have two separate systems, one for your regulated work and one for everything else. But if you have two separate systems across two distinct software, this means two distinct entities to maintain, two sets of training, potential gaps in traceability, etc. The way that Cynote solves this is giving you the ability to have two separate workspaces under a single Cynote environment. So each workspace in Cynote is completely siloed from each other. It has its own access controls, its own audit trail, and there is no data crossover between both the workspaces. For the GxP workspace, when someone is operating that workspace, you can ensure all the protocols are locked. So the results section is only accepting specific entries into specific fields. Every action is logged with a timestamp, user ID, and the audit trail is readily accessible to you. And you can also implement electronic signatures where they're required in this GxP compliant environment. And then your R&D environment it still has all these features, but you may not be implementing them or having permissions that are as strict as the GxP environment. And with that being said, I will hand it back to Mathias sorry, we have another poll here. My mistake. So before we move on, we'd like to understand, how are you currently managing data in your GxP environment? And the poll should be live. And we're seeing some responses. Awesome. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, I'll share the results now. And a lot of great answers. So it looks like there's quite a few people still using primarily paper-based systems, or that said, we're just getting started. So I hope you're finding a lot of the content we're talking about here today relevant and useful to you. We see some folks that already have an ELN or LIMS in place. So if you have any questions specific to ELN or LIMS, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And then, yeah, if there's any other questions, again, please drop it in the chat. We're happy to go over that towards the end or even reach out to you directly. And so now I will hand it over back to Matthias to take us through the rest of the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Arun. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the polls. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about going digital. So we saw that we tried to get some information about how much of the GxP environments out there are still paper-based, and it's difficult to get that information, but it's the info that we got is sort of consistent with the answers we got today in just the previous poll. So sometimes it's referenced between 40 and sometimes even much more than 50% of environments are still paper-based. In general, the labs are today really generating a lot of digital information that's either originating from instruments, or you have other electronic records that you keep in different softwares. A lot of organizations are operating over different locations, so there's increasingly a lot of usage of collaborative tools, software solutions that are typically cloud-based, and those work is spread out between different locations. So parts of workflow, such as approvals, can also happen remotely. And whenever you're using the digital tools, it's very tempting to use the automation of your workflows when it comes to your work. Using any digital software does come with some compliance risks. It's very easy to get trapped into making some uncontrolled data changes. It's easier if you're using multiple digital tools to have a gap in traceability. If you get a gap in your audit trails, you can have inconsistency in the way you are managing your documentation. And in the end, if you're using multiple tools, siloing of information can happen that can lead to problems with duplication of work and also challenges when preparing for audits and inspections. And in the same way, it's causing limitations of access across different teams, let's say R&D, regulated team, QC teams. When it comes to GxP environments, these changes or these challenges are even amplified. So essentially, any change that's introduced into a GxP environment becomes a risk that you have to manage it. And therefore, managing those changes does become a bit more expensive than in non-GxP environments and can become hard to govern clearly. So when it comes to using paper versus software solutions, we have some pros and cons on both sides. So for paper-based GxP environments, you have a complete control, full control over your processes. You govern it completely. So if changes come, they come from within. At the same time, these paper-based systems are very tempting to get teams get very comfortable with the status quo, and innovations may be stalling. When it comes to using softwares in GxP environments, the pros are that you get the benefits of digital tooling, including efficiency and so on, and we'll continue to talk about those today as well. And you get also boosts, the improvements do get a boost. For example, digital platforms such as Synode do provide some feedback insights about how you're using them, and that can be a feedback loop into improving your processes, finding the bottlenecks. But there are also cons related to using software. So with software as an external tool and a partner, teams become dependent on an external tool and partner. So that's then a risk that you have to manage. And sometimes softwares, of course, get updates, they get changed, improved. Sometimes even smaller software changes may pose a bigger or can turn into a bigger change for the environment, and that can also lead to maybe even changing the GxP process itself, which is an expensive thing. Good. So I think we can move to the next slide. One of the common or frequent misconceptions that we still get at Synode is that by purchasing a software that's also intended to be used in GxP environments, this makes the organization who got the software automatically compliant. In reality, software is actually a part of the solution. So softwares, platforms like Synode bring a long list of capabilities such as audit trace, electronic signatures, and so on. However, on the organization side, the organization still needs to determine the intended use of the software, configure the software appropriately, validate the software, prepare the SOPs, trainings, have a good quality assurance oversight, and then has to manage risks and change control that come with inevitable software improvements. And essentially, for example, a GAMP5 is a set of principles or procedures that help companies, GxP or GMP environments, to ensure that the software that they're using has a required quality. Although that's targeting pharma environment primarily, it can be also used outside of that as well. And what we see is that essentially collaboration between supplier or a vendor and the users, so the environment that's regulated, is something that really helps the end users to validate their software according to their validation procedures. So then the computer system validation, computer system assurance becomes easier. So we see that the compliance actually originates from a combination of knowledgeable people, processes, tools, technology, and governance. So that's a collaborative approach or a shared responsibility. So now let's see how Signote can actually support the regulated environments. As we saw, there are two parts to for the environment to become compliant. One is the using software capabilities, and then there can be some help from the vendor for the organizational part, and we'll go through both next. So first, let's dive into these capabilities that Signote brings. So those you have also seen in some of those you have also seen in Arun's example. I'll still point out a couple. So access control is a critical thing. With this, we are defining a Signote as a lab platform. We are defining it as a closed system, and with this, we are ensuring that the only authorized personnel can access electronic records, and that in this way, the system ensures authenticity, confidentiality of electronic records, and so on. And we achieve that through strict access control. This is an example of controlling access at the Signote project level. And there are also on next slide, we have an example of controlling the access with using specific role-based access controls on experiments and then also on inventory. So on various parts of Signote product, you have the option to granularly control the access. Yeah. On the next slide, we've heard about the CFR 21 Part 11 and Annex 11. This has two kind of main requirements for electronic systems. First is having time-stamped electronic signatures that are linked to electronic records. On the screenshot, we have an appearance how these signatures are linked to Signote's task, which is an electronic record in Signote. And also the second requirement is to have time-stamped and immutable audit trail records, which also show the history of all the changes, including what was changed, so the content of each individual change. So with that, we ensure the audit readiness, the inspection readiness, and also ensure that the records are human readable, including their past versions. Signote also ensures end-to-end traceability. And with this, we mean that, for example, with Signote, you can get what we call out-of-the-box contextualization of data entries without compromising the traceability. So with just using Signote, different parts of Signote, such as experiments, samples, reagents, SOPs, even integrations, if you have them, consumption of reagents using storage locations, information about who used things, all that automatically generates a laboratory context that's really rich. We also have, of course, the very detailed activity logs. For example, even down to, or maybe that's another example of, it's a screenshot of a Signote task. That's an example how we are how this contextual information kind of look or are fallen together in the task level. So we see that the protocols, results, inventory items, signatures, how they are tied in together. On the next slide, you'll be able to see an example of Synod's detailed activity log. So we log all the actions down to the checking of individual checklists. That ensures full traceability. We also have the capability of storing snapshots of calibration and maintenance data at the time of usage if you're using that in Synod. And with that, we also are contributing to data integrity and audit readiness. Data integrity has a long list of features because it's spread across the entire platform. So with this, we have the ability, as Arun mentioned, to log specific parts of the protocols. So to ensure that the instructions cannot be changed, you have the ability to archive things in Synod, to remove them from your point of view, but not delete them. If you would require still deletion, we have abilities where you can control whether you have the ability to delete things or not. And even if you have the ability to delete things, the records still remain intact in the audit trails. We have capabilities like Synod Edit, where that ensures that you don't need to manually download and upload files to edit them, and that happens seamlessly, so that all of the information with file versioning happens in Synod. If we move to the next slide, you'll be able to see, for example, that Synod supports versioning. That's an example of versioning of SOPs or protocols that's controlled, including the controlling of the access to the individual protocol for very granular access control. So that ensures Synod's data integrity. We have also underlying functionalities and properties of Synod that ensure cybersecurity. So with this part is usually more, of interest for your IT departments and maybe legal departments, but Synod does have the Synod Trust Center where you can access a lot more of the documentations, documents related to these policies, and so on. And we are maintaining a couple of certifications ourselves, like ISO 27001 and SOC 2 Type 1 and 2, and others. So when it comes to the non-functionality things relate or non-product capabilities of Synod, we do support as a vendor regulated environments to help them get through the CSV CSA. Primarily through our Platinum offering. So that was also mentioned by Arun, and this ensures fewer releases, only 2 releases per year. The customers do get 3 environments, so the live production environment that's used in the lab, the validation environment, that's the purpose of getting the new version of Synod validated, and the Agile Sandbox, which is in sync with our Agile releases. And we do announce this schedule. We do schedule these announcements for the releases well in advance. So we send the announcements along with the validation package documentation 8 to 10 weeks in advance, and there is a window of 6 weeks that's allocated for validating after you get the update of new version to your validation environment. We are committed to quality, so that's why we also have internal quality management system that covers the entire software development lifecycle with many procedures. As mentioned, we are maintaining the growing list of certifications, and when needed, we can also enter quality agreements with our customers. And as a last part of my I'd like to talk a little bit about this validation package of the documents that I've mentioned earlier. So let's say according to the validation life cycle of GAMP5 for category 4 electronic system, where we believe Synode falls into, the organization has to provide different types of elements. One is validation master plan that needs to be provided by the regulated entity, so on the customer side. We do have, so customers, users in regulated environments need to have a user requirement specification for every software that documents what the intended use of the software would be. Although that's in the domain of the customer, Synode does provide and maintain the URS document with every release, and that can be used as a foundation for the customer's URS document, and that fits then into the validation master plan. Environments need to manage risks, and they have to assess risks, so including the risks of identifying which parts of system functionalities have the greatest impact on their data and processes. So Synode helps this part with detailed release notes provided with every release, and we also categorize some changes that help you assess the risk on your end. And lastly, the environment needs to ensure qualifications. So installation qualification, IQs, operation qualifications, OQs, those are helped or supplied by Synode. So Synode provides the IQ reports for every release for our cloud environments, so signed by Synode. And for the OQs, we provide a template of operational qualifications that's maintained with every release, and that can be used as a foundation for your OQs. The PQs have to be, in any case, performed within the regulated environment, and that remains in the domain of the regulated entity. So with this, I would like to conclude also my part, and with this, the webinar part. I'd like to thank you for your attention. We do have a Q&A session open, so feel free to submit your questions, and we can check whether we got some already.
Yeah, we do have one question, Matthias. So the question is there a sandbox environment available for admins? I'm talking about design of calibration maintenance program by Synode, but we want to run some experiments first. So it sounds like they want to test some development activities first before bringing it into production. And I think you mentioned this in the CSV slide that we do provide production, validation, and a sandbox environment for our customers under the Platinum offering.
Correct. So I think for this purpose, the validation environment might be more appropriate because it also gets updates, let's say, synchronized twice a year. But the Agile, the sandbox environment can also be used. It gets a little bit more frequent updates, so you can see what will be the new functionalities that will be coming up. Okay.
And then I see another question about how long does it take to validate Synode as a software?
Yes, so I think that's you can also help, Arun, if you want here. I think that this really is really defined by the intended use. So for what purpose you would like to use Synode, how many of your processes you are actually executing or running with Synode, so that determines the scope. We do have, I've mentioned a couple of slides ago, we do have this gap of 6 weeks between the validation and the production environment upgrade. And this, in our experience, is a sufficient time for organizations to prepare the validation. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I would echo the same thing Matjaž said. Maybe add that so when Cynote does perform a new release, we do give you an OQ document of the OQ test cases that you can replicate. And then we also give you an OQ test report that we perform internally on one of our
Mhm.
environments that has the exact same version that you would get in Cynote. So you could, in theory, leverage the OQ report we share with you and just build on top of it to test some additional test cases, which would reduce your validation time significantly. And even if you were to repeat the entire OQ protocol, your first time might take a little bit long just to get used to the software. But for some of our customers that have done this repeatedly, they say it doesn't take them more than one working day, worst case scenario. So it is relatively quick because we try to give you as much of the documentation to leverage as possible. And then, Mateo, there's a question related to on-premise. So can we have an on-premise GxP environment?
Yes, so Cynote has on-prem availability. We would recommend for customers to, when they're deciding for on-prem versus cloud, to add to the consideration that, for example, the cybersecurity aspect of the tool. So Cynote is with purpose getting certifications for cybersecurity, and that, of course, apply to the, let's say, the environments that we control, so to the cloud version of Cynote. And this in the local environments needs to be, of course, taken care of by the IT teams that are local. So that's, I think, the main difference. And the installation qualifications have to be performed by the
Yeah.
local teams as well. So there's a little bit more, let's say, bureaucracy related to this part.
Yeah, and that shared burden of responsibility, I guess a little bit more of it shifts to the customer side,
Correct.
or
Yes.
specifically the IT team on the
Yeah,
customer side.
it does.
And then I think we have one more question that I see. What happens to our decades of historical paper records? Do we have to digitize all of it? Now that's
Um, Yeah, so it's like, I think it's a general question related to digitization, right? And there are a couple of approaches that you can have. So one is a clean slate, is just to have records up to a certain point in one system, let's say paper-based, and then you start with a new system, electronic system. So that's a clean slate approach. The other one is that we do see that sometimes customers digitize their records at least to the level that they are searchable. So they have, for example, scanning conversion to PDF that has some capabilities of extracting the text, and then that can be imported into the Cynote, for example, for the last specific periods of time, maybe for some overlapping projects that are still ongoing, purely for the searchability reasons. And that's another approach. Um,
yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of it just depends on you know, how much legacy data you have. Of course, if this spans like 20, 30 years, then you may need to maintain your paper records as you're slowly digitizing and indexing those records over time.
right, right. You'll have there are retention periods that come with certain regulations, and you will still continue to have to oblige by those for the paper trackers as well, yes.
And then the last question that I see so far, so this one is asking, what if we do not want a or some new capability? Can we not
Mhm.
have it to reduce the scope of change management and validation?
Yes, so that's this is related to the risks, right? So if the team, the environment does not benefit from a certain new capability, that only adds to the risk that you have to manage. So that's then the downside of the softwares. With Signout, we are trying to make as many new capabilities configurable. So let's say switchable on or off. And that would be also for the purpose of maybe ensuring or having so that the regulated environments have flexibility of configuring Signout, whether certain capabilities should be present or not, simply because the scope of the computer system validation can get smaller, and therefore the risks as well.
And I would say there's an element of shared responsibility here as well, because if there's a feature that we're not able to switch off, then you would control this with a process. And typically, if you're operating in a regulated environment and putting regulated data into Signote, you would have an SOP on how Signote needs to be used for certain use cases, and you would have the users trained against that SOP and maintain a training record that they did read that SOP or training document and confirm that they understand everything. So that way there's a process element in terms of managing what features should not be used because they weren't validated. We have a minute left, so any final questions, please feel free to drop them in here.
Arun, did you answer the question if the software can be tested before purchased?
Yes, I think Run had that
Oh,
conversation in the
okay.
chat, and
Perfect.
we will reach out to them directly by email.
Excellent.
All right. Well, I think we're at time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, for participating, for all of your questions. If there's anything that we didn't answer or you're curious to learn more, please reach out to us directly by email. So you can see the email here. It's just premium@signote.net. And we're happy to take a meeting with you, talk through more features in depth or anything else related to Signote. And with that being said, thank you, Mathias. Thank you, everyone.